In this section, which is number 17 in our overall analysis of Module 4 on global sourcing, this is where we're going to take into account the different units of measure that go into calculating landed cost. First, the ability to accurately calculate landed cost on a product-specific level is very difficult to do. We're going to say that right out of the gate. We've said it a bunch of times. Landed cost estimates before actuals actually start to come in, they're going to be wrong to some degree. We want it to be accurate, obviously, but they will never be perfect. We have to compare our estimates, our budgeted landed cost number for an item, with the actual results. One of the key tricks in getting to an accurate landed cost calculation is to be able to allocate costs to an item on a pro-rated basis. We have a detailed explanation of prorating costs in just one moment, so don't worry if it's a little bit cloudy. But let's say for now that a prorated basis means the actual amount of a transportation or customs-related expense that can be attributed to a product, a single product, especially when there are many different products in one container. As we've been building up to, a big part of the challenge is related to the fact that different transportation and customs-related expenses use a unique unit of measure, UOM. We talked a little bit about this in the previous section. Now we're going to go deep into the subject. Let's present this fairly complex concept as a supply chain perspective, prorated ocean costs, ocean freight and related costs only. One of the biggest challenges associated with determining the transportation component of a landed cost calculation is the need to express overall costs on a product-specific basis. For example, and specific to ocean costs, how does a U.S. importer take the total cost of transporting an ocean container and divide that cost amongst all of the items in that container? The answer to this question lies in the ability to prorate costs on a product-specific basis. Second paragraph. For purposes of ocean freight, prorating means assigning a cost to a product that is proportionate to either the amount of space or weight it occupies in a container. In order to do that, the unit of measure used to arrive at the prorated cost must be expressed as a cubic meter. This is super important. The unit of measure for ocean freight, in the end, for calculating landed cost, is a cubic meter. Depending on the profile of a given product, it could be a heavy product, it could be a voluminous product. But for purposes of landed cost, we want to be talking in cubic meters. Once the cost per container is expressed on a CBM basis, cubic meter basis, a prorated cost can be assigned to a specific product. Upcoming slides provide a detailed example of how that calculation works. That's our bigger, more in-depth case study. It should be noted that most importers do load more than one product type into an ocean container, each of which possesses its own characteristics, such as carton dimensions, weight, and case pack quantity. We just talked about that a moment ago. Voluminous cargo, heavy cargo. When we use the cubic meter as a unit of measure, it makes those calculations easier. Why is that? One of the advantages of using the CBM as the unit of measure for ocean freight is that transportation costs can be prorated across multiple products, regardless of how many different products are loaded into a container. Let's continue to work this idea and bring it to life. Calculated landed cost, different units of measure. Examples of different units of measure for transportation and customs-related costs are, first off, the product itself, typically on a per unit basis, one item, no matter what it is. However, depending on the product, it could be priced in dozens for men's cotton shirts, for example, liters for types of chemicals coming in, or yards for rolls of fabric. The key point here is we want to identify the unit of measure for the product itself. Moving on, full container load, FCL ocean freight. That is based on a per container basis. We saw that in our previous example. $1,450 for a 40-foot high cube container going from Ningbo to Los Angeles. That's a unit of measure. The key is, as it relates to ocean freight, and we spoke of a moment ago, we want to express that cost on a per cubic meter basis. More on that in just a bit. We have terminal handling charges at origin. That's on a per container basis. We have bunker surcharge, the type of diesel fuel that ships run on. That's on a per container basis. If items are being consolidated at origin at a freight forwarder's warehouse, purchase orders from multiple vendors coming in and being consolidated into a single container, there's a CFS fee, container freight station fee. That's on a per cubic meter basis and is separate from any full container load transportation charge. Some others, maybe we as the importer don't have enough freight to fill a container at origin. We buy in smaller quantities from multiple vendors that are spread out all over the place, and we can't consolidate in containers, so we have to use less than container load ocean freight. That's on a per cubic meter basis. If we use air freight, that's going to be on a per kilo basis. So what becomes of a landed cost calculation for a given item from the same vendor where we use a mix of ocean freight and air freight? That's a complex calculation. We'll get to that later as well. Documentation requirements, ocean bills of lading, etc., that's on a per shipment basis. Customs clearance in the U.S., that's on a per entry basis. That $85 fee we saw in our first example. And we could easily have 10 containers coming in under one entry. We have to be able to allocate that cost of $85, for example, across 10 containers, and then assign that cost to the items that are in those containers. Pretty complex stuff. And to use another unit of measure, customs duties are usually, not always, but most of the time, a percentage of the value of the goods. We saw that in our example. It was 5%, you will recall. Clearly, in just a couple of slides, we can see all of the different units of measure. How do we get this all into one unit of measure so we can assign, so we can prorate costs on an item-specific basis? Well, we're not finished yet. There are even more costs, so it becomes even more complex. We talked about MPF and HMF in our example, merchandise processing fee, harbor maintenance fee. These are charges levied by U.S. Customs and Border Protection in addition to customs duties. MPF is a percentage of the value of the goods, but it has a minimum and a maximum charge. We saw the maximum reached around $500 in our example. And then HMF is also a percentage of the value of the goods. Next sub-bullet point, if we're bringing in full container loads that need to be stripped at the port of destination, that's called a deconsolidation fee. A third party will strip an ocean container and distribute goods out to the United States based on the instructions from the U.S. importer. Sometimes called a stripping fee, sometimes a transload fee, deconsolidation. They're all pretty much synonymous terms, but there is a charge for it, and that's on a per container basis. If we're moving goods out from a deconsolidation center to different points in the United States by truckload, that's FTL, full truckload. That unit of measure is by trailer. And U.S. truck trailers do not have the same configurations as ocean containers. Most truck trailers, not all, most truck trailers in the United States are 53 feet long. We know already that ocean containers are 20-footers, 40-footers, 40 high cubes, 45-footers. It's a different unit of measure, a different capacity for a truck trailer. If we move goods inland in the U.S. via less than truckload, that's going to be on a per pound basis, but on the freight classification of the goods. Are they dense goods? Are they voluminous goods? We'll get into that later on, way later on. But for now, let's say that it's yet another different unit of measure per pound. And then small parcel. By the parcel itself, the carton itself, but by zone, geographic zone, and the type of service level used. More on that when we get to domestic distribution as well. Let's wrap up this section with yet another supply chain perspective, the impact of detention and demurrage. We talked a little bit about this. Let's talk about it some more. When an importer proactively calculates the landed cost of a particular item, there are many costs that are known in advance, including the unit price of the product, customs duty, and the negotiated ocean freight rate. Unfortunately, there are other charges that may be incurred that render the original landed cost calculation inaccurate. Two of those potential costs are detention and demurrage. And they are, as we see parenthetically, related to ocean and or domestic intermodal transportation. Intermodal transportation involving truck to rail to truck for final delivery. Second paragraph. For purposes of clarification, demurrage refers to charges levied by a steamship line when an ocean container is not picked up in a timely fashion from a container terminal. Conversely, detention occurs when an ocean container or domestic trailer is not returned to the carrier in a timely fashion. That's when the importer has the equipment, the container or the trailer, and just takes their time bringing it back. That little drill can be very, very expensive. It should be noted that the definition of timely is defined as the explicit amount of free time that an importer negotiates with its carriers. The importer has to negotiate free time. We'll get into that later on as well. For now, we're focusing on what does demurrage and detention mean and how can it blow up landed cost estimates. The problem with demurrage and detention as they relate to landed cost is that the importer has no way of knowing in advance if these charges will be incurred, and if so, in what amount. That only makes sense. How are we as an importer supposed to know how much detention and demurrage we're going to have until actual containers arrive? We can estimate landed cost all we want. We have to see how it plays out in the real world. This phenomenon is due to the fact that demurrage and detention occur on a container or trailer-specific basis, as goods are actually shipped. Given this reality, importers may consider calculating an average demurrage or detention cost per year and include that figure in its landed cost calculation. That's a budgeting decision. That's a landed cost estimating decision that the importer will have to make. It's not a bad idea. In fact, when demurrage and detention can be isolated, it can then be measured, root causes determined, and action taken to reduce its occurrence in the future. That's it for this section. When we come back, we're going to go through a more advanced methodology for calculating landed cost.